Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of pornography and the controversy over pornography. My guest for this is Kelsy Burke. Kelsy Burke is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is the author of several books. Her latest is called The Pornography Wars, The Past, Present, and Future of America's Obscene Obsession. It is what we will be in conversation about. Kelsy Burke, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me.
You begin, and I want to be, you divide the book into three different parts. The three different parts. The first part really focuses on the history of pornography, beginning in the Civil War era. Why begin there?
I am not a historian. I'm a sociologist. I originally thought that maybe I'd have a chapter that talked about the historical context for debates over porn in the United States. And it ended up being, as you say, about a third of the book, because what I wanted to explain is, how did we get here? How did we get to the current present moment? And I just kept discovering more and more that I wanted to say and discuss in the book. And I go back to the time of the Civil War because before that, of course, Americans were able to get their hands on pornographic materials. So little pamphlets or magazines, booklets, paintings, photographs, but they were largely an import. So they often came from Great Britain, were often sold on at ports in cities on the East Coast. But a law passed in the mid-19th century that made it illegal to bring in pornographic or obscene materials using the U.S. Customs. So Americans had to start producing it on their own, which they did very readily, especially in New York City. I write about a historical figure who's actually been in the news as of late, Anthony Comstock, who has been making the news today because part of his efforts banned access to contraception. But he was also a very devout conservative Protestant who believed Americans should not be looking at illicit materials or pornographic materials. And so shortly after the Civil War, he urged Congress to pass a series of laws that didn't necessarily change the obscenity code. So it was always illegal to distribute obscenity, but he increased the fines and charges of those convictions. And so that is when America really started cracking down on obscenity. And so that's where I start my story.
Is Anthony Comstock working out of a vacuum here, or is there sort of a moral movement that's also occurring at the same time?
That's a great question. The United States at the end of the 19th century is really changing. It's, immigration is increasing in huge numbers, which is changing the American population. Urbanization is happening where people are moving out of rural communities into cities. So there's a lot of broader social shifts where Americans are questioning their identities. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Americans are questioning, what does it mean to be an American? And Comstock was a part of a broader movement. In fact, his efforts were often associated with the YMCA in New York City, the Young Men's Christian Association, that believed that, America needed to hold on to this strict moral foundation rooted in Protestant values. And so he was not an isolated figure by any means in his efforts to push back against what was described at the time as a kind of modernization of American society.
You are a sociologist of religion. Isn't this also right around the same time we get the rise of the evangelical movement?
Yeah, so there's a few different evangelical movements over time in American history, but this is certainly one in the middle of the 19th century, and then again in the beginning of the 20th century. So the beginning of the 20th century is where we have the rise of what we think of as fundamentalism, where a certain sect of conservative Protestants really rejected these progressive changes happening in American society and said that the way that they would adapt to these changes is to create their own separate social institutions. So their own separate schools, their own separate churches that were different from other denominational churches at the time. And so that is all around this same time period where Americans are trying to figure out what is the place of sexuality in public society.
And that's significant. Where is the place of sexuality in public society?
Well, for Anthony Comstock, he had a really hard line where he opposed nudity in any form. So he didn't think that it should be taught in schools. You know, he was against plays and literature that would recognize and sort of celebrate the human body. He was more of an outlier, and he was often mocked by his contemporary journalists at the time of being sort of a religious zealot. So other Americans were becoming more comfortable with sexuality as something that should be taught, for example, to children or within schools, that we know that there's a role within education that sex is important. Actually, someone I write about in the book, her name is Mary Ware Dennett, was arrested on obscenity charges for creating a pamphlet that was distributed by a medical journal that had anatomical drawings. She originally created it for her teenage sons because she wanted to teach them about the reality of sex, and in the spirit of keeping them safe, not to promote promiscuity or anything like that. But she was arrested and convicted on obscenity charges. Later, when her lawyer appealed to the case, it was thrown out. And the court did say, we have to make a distinction between obscenity and sexual material that can be used for educational purposes. And that's a precedent that has, lasted to the present day.
Yeah. I mean, these laws are still on the books. The Comstock laws.
They are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Recently, just in this past year, there have been a number of states that have attempted to revise their obscenity codes. We've been hearing in the news a lot about book bans. One of the ways in which this has occurred in various states is through revising obscenity codes, which often provide a line for exceptions for schools and libraries that they can have sexual material for educational purposes. So you can't convict schools or libraries that have this kind of material. So in where I live, the state of Nebraska, there was a bill proposed that would remove that exception from the law, which means that parents could bring lawsuits against public libraries or elementary schools for any material that they deemed obscene or inappropriate. And this could potentially lead this material to be out of these public places. In Nebraska, that law was not successful, but in other places, most notably Florida, we know that this has occurred. So this is all related to obscenity laws, which, yes, are still on the books today.
And they were also important in the 1950s in what was known as the Lavender Scare, in which the government was going after homosexuals and communists, and they were going through the mail to try to find out about people.
Yeah, in the book, I spend a lot of time writing about J. Edgar Hoover, who shares a lot of the moral values of Anthony Comstock. But unlike Comstock, he has unprecedented power within the United States. So he's the director of the FBI for almost 50 years, from 1924 to 1972, the year of his death. And he created it was separate from the sex deviance file, which was his file that for homosexual activity or behavior. He created a separate file called the Obscene file in the 1940s, but there was often overlap because for Hoover, these were overlapping threats when it came to sexual deviancy. So yes, these were ways that the FBI kept track of anyone deemed to violate heterosexual norms. The Obscene file was huge. By the 90s, there were over 100,000 cases in that file, and it was used to prosecute and investigate many public figures who were artists and activists and were not in the formal pornography industry, but were deemed by Hoover to be a threat to national identity and what he said, national security.
I do want to ask you about another figure that Anthony Comstock went after that you write about. It's a very tragic story, that of the story of Ida Craddock, if I'm saying her name correctly.
Yeah, Ida Craddock was one of Comstock's contemporaries. She was a spiritualist, which was a religious practice that was popular in the late 19th century, especially among white middle class women like her. This is a practice that involved communicating with the dead. And for Craddock, she eventually believed that she married one of the spirits that she communicated with. She called him Soph. She started signing her correspondence as Mrs. Craddock, based on this so-called marriage. And also based on this marriage, she started writing pamphlets on sexual instruction. Much like Mary Ware Dennett, we would not consider these pamphlets to be risque by contemporary standards. She promoted sex only in the context of marriage, but she did write openly about sexual pleasure. She promoted women's sexual pleasure, and Comstock had her arrested on obscenity charges. Originally, she was arrested on charges based on New York State's obscenity laws. She served 3 months in a workhouse, and as soon as she was released, Comstock arranged for her arrest again, this time under federal obscenity laws. She was convicted to a 5-year prison sentence and eventually died of suicide before she started serving that time. In her suicide note, she called Comstock himself a pervert and described his crusade as being for his own satisfaction and pleasure. And I do think that her case shows the vindictiveness of which Comstock often went after certain figures that he targeted.
Yeah. I said in the introduction we're going to be talking about the history of pornography. None of this sounds like pornography yet.
That's right. I mean, isn't this sort of the classic question, like what counts? What is the definition of pornography? The famous line from Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, "I know it when I see it." That seems unsatisfactory, but it kind of is accurate in that definitions of pornography, for me as a sociologist, always depend on their social context. And so, yes, what was being debated and attempted to be outlawed in the 19th century would be really different than what we think of as like hardcore internet pornography today. So I think the standards for what counts as pornographic and what counts as obscene, those are two different things, that has changed over time. And that's part of what, American society and specifically the courts have had to reckon with.
I suspect pornography has changed as technology has changed, as the media technology has changed and the invention of film.
Absolutely. So we know that how we access porn has certainly changed, especially with the age of the internet. But even long before that, as soon as we developed the technology for motion pictures, pornographic films were being produced. These were often called stag pictures. This is a word that comes from the fact that they would often be viewed among groups of men. So we know that pornographic films have been along really since the invention of film itself. And with all new technologies, we've sort of seen the pornographic medium take on a new dimension.
We also see, I guess we call it pornography, but maybe not. It's usually not referred to as pornography, but we also see it in ancient forms of media too. You see it in cave drawings, or you go to a museum in which they have ancient art from all over anywhere in the world, and you'll see sexually graphic images. But I was thinking about that, and I actually find it interesting. Of all the writings we have of the ancient world, I never have come across anything in which somebody's complaining about pornography.
That's right. Well, I think that's an interesting point, and one that I make in the introduction of the book, actually, is that, we know that people have been creating images or depictions of sex and sexuality really as long as humans have existed. We've found evidence from the prehistoric era that there are, little figures that seem to be pendants or jewelry that depict a female body with very exaggerated genitalia and breasts. When these figures were discovered by archaeologists, the news headlines were, this is the world's oldest pornography. But historians of pornography actually push back against that and say, no, that's not pornography exactly, because I really like the definition of a historian, Walter Kendrick, who says pornography names an argument, not a thing. So in order for something to be pornographic, we have to have social conflict around it. And we can certainly imagine these early humans were not getting riled up over these depictions of sex and sexuality. So I think your point is a really good one, that often historians of pornography name a starting point, a time in which pornography is invented and emerges. And often they trace this back to the early 1800s, where elites in Europe start saying that all this artwork, often very old Greek artwork, needs to be put away in storage rooms and in the back spaces of museums because they're not appropriate for public viewing. Prior to this time, there wasn't this sentiment that certain depictions of sexuality should be off limits. But when this occurs, this is when what we think of now, our definition of pornography, really comes into being.
That's interesting about the social conflict and that connection to what we consider pornography. And I couldn't help but laugh because I just started thinking maybe historians 2,000 years from now will look back at us and be like, they were really fixated on sexuality.
Yeah, well, and it's a relatively modern conflict. So we'll see what the future holds, for how long it will capture. I say that the subtitle of the book is America's Obscene Obsession. And I think that it really does capture that Americans have been obsessed with depictions of sex and pornography for now well over 2 centuries.
Can you briefly go over for me sort of the legal aspects of pornography? Has it ever not been legal? What obviously it's legal now.
So this is something that I really had to become educated on, because I didn't necessarily know the distinction between, I heard from sex workers that I spoke with about, pornography being legal. But I also heard from anti-porn activists who talked about how the existing laws, should actually be used to outlaw or crack down on many forms of internet pornography. So I was a little bit confused, but tracing back the history, we can see how the courts have often not been very good at clearly defining the distinction between pornography and obscenity. So in the 1950s, so this is almost a century after the Comstock laws are passed, when the courts hadn't really adequately made any updates to what counts as obscenity. But in the 1950s, a case comes before the court, Roth v. the United States. It was decided in 1957. Samuel Roth was a magazine publisher, and he had been arrested many, many times over the past decades on obscenity charges. But this case made its way to the Supreme Court because his lawyer started making what was a really novel argument at the time, which is that these charges against Roth actually violated his free speech First Amendment right. And this hadn't really been argued in the courts prior to that. So the courts took on the case and decided, they determined what they called the Roth standard, that some material was protected under the First Amendment, but obscenity was not protected. And they defined obscenity whether an average person applying contemporary standards would find the material to appeal to prurient interests. So to be sort of only about sex, have no other, I'm using air quotes here, redeeming qualities. That was updated slightly in the early 1970s when the Supreme Court ruled in a case, Miller v. California. That's sort of the standard to which the courts use today, the Miller test or the Miller standard. So again, that refers to this average person finding material appealing to prurient interests, but adds on that the work must be offensive and that the work has to lack any literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So all of these are pretty subjective measures that the courts have to draw the line somewhere. But it is true that there are some types of materials that have been consistently ruled as obscene by the courts. But for most mainstream commercial pornography today, that is legal, so long as it is involving consenting adults and so long as their activities don't deviate into the realm of what the courts would consider obscene.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Kelsy Burke. She is the author of the book, The Pornography Wars, The Past, Present, and Future of America's Obscene Obsession. Kelsy Burke is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her previous book was called Christians Under Covers. How has the internet changed pornography? And perhaps we could have spent the entire hour on that question, but...
The internet, so I write in the book that the internet changed everything and nothing. Because in some ways, the debates that we're hearing in 2023 about the harms of internet pornography and what we need to do about it are decades, even centuries old. So the idea that pornography harms marriage and families, that children shouldn't be exposed to it, that it's degrading women, along with sort of our moral compass within society. All of these are very long arguments against pornography, and they're the same today as they were in the 1870s or 1970s. But of course, the internet did change how we consume pornography, and it also changed the industry itself. So it makes pornography anonymous. You no longer have to go into a VHS rental store or to a magazine stand to access pornography. You can do it on the phone that is in your pocket, and it's free. So there are many sites that offer free streaming videos, often that are violating copyright and that are pirated videos, but that you don't have to pay for it anymore. So that's had drastic ramifications for the pornography industry itself. Many people within the industry told me the porn industry no longer exists, that it just doesn't exist in the same way that it did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. In the 1990s or early 2000s, porn stars could get a contract with a big production company, make a couple videos a month, do some other public appearances, and they could make a very good living. They could sort of live out what we think of when we think of the quote unquote porn star. But today, it's no longer possible to make a living in commercial porn alone. There aren't as many shoots. The pay for those shoots has declined, and that's because the internet has made it so that people access these videos in a variety of ways that aren't giving money back to production companies and aren't giving money back to performers. Instead, the money is held up in the companies of the websites themselves through ad revenue. So that's a really different model than the porn industry of the past.
So it's the websites that are making the money now.
That's right. The porn workers that I talked to were engaged in a variety of different, what they often described as hustles, in order to make a living. So they do make money through sites like OnlyFans or ManyVids. There's a number of different sites that offer payouts for performers. Pornhub has its own conglomerate called Model Hub, where performers can get money based on views of their videos and things like that. But yeah, for the most part, because these free online video or online websites exist, that does not offer any money for performers when their videos are circulated for free. And instead, it's the ad revenue and the people who work for the websites that are making the most money.
Does Pornhub operate similarly to YouTube, where actually people upload the videos?
That's right. People upload the videos, and some of the biggest critiques over Pornhub has been the lack of regulation on uploads and the fact that until very recently, people could download videos similar to YouTube, so they could then own those videos. So if videos that would later be taken down, either because they violated copyright or because they depicted illegal activity, child sexual assault, non-consensual sex, that those videos could still be circulating because they could be downloaded by users and then uploaded again. Pornhub has been under fire for many, many years now, especially from the anti-porn movement. Nicholas Kristof, the opinion columnist for the New York Times, wrote a big piece that he called The Children of Pornhub, where he describes himself as not anti-porn, but anti-Pornhub, saying that, we really need to find a way to regulate the content on this site and sites like it. But importantly, Pornhub is also a villain in some ways among the people I talk to who work within the porn industry, sex workers, activists, people who I call a part of the porn positive movement. I don't use the word pro-porn precisely because many of these people are very critical of the commercial industry and are very critical of Pornhub and the corporation that owns it, formerly MindGeek. It was just purchased by a new company called Ethical Capital Partners, a Canadian equity firm. So they say that Pornhub is sort of like the Amazon.com of pornography, that it's wiped out independent and smaller businesses for the profit of very few, not the majority of workers.
Is this the most popular porn website? Pornhub?
It is. It's the most widely used website. But I think this is something else that's an interesting observation, is that pornographic websites are hugely popular, some of the most widely used websites in the world. And at the same time, similar to attacks on social media websites, which are also widely popular, that they are widely used at the same time as being widely condemned.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something to think about if you want to be socially conscious and you're looking at internet, which many people do, or you're looking at porn on the internet, which many people do, is when you're watching it for free, there's a detrimental aspect to that.
Yeah. One of the things that I say there's common ground across both sides of pornography debates is the belief that you shouldn't watch free porn. For the anti-porn movement, it would be that you shouldn't be watching any porn, free or otherwise. But from the folks I talk to within the industry, they say that, you should, if you want to support sex workers, you should pay for your pornography. And there's many ways that you can do that. And that they say that that's sort of the first step to promoting the rights and livelihoods of sex workers themselves.
Yeah. And it's not just left, right, or conservative, liberal, or conservative religious and liberal, because even in the left, you have divisions over porn and sex work in general. There are people on the left who will say, and I hear from them when we have done shows about the history of sex worker rights and the push for getting such sort of labor protections for sex workers. I will hear from some listeners who will say, no matter if they're consenting, no matter what, porn is exploitative of women, especially.
Yeah, that's been an argument for a long time, first coming from the feminist movement in the 1970s. Conservatives took up that same language shortly thereafter, saying that porn harms not only women within the industry, which for anti-porn feminists, they see the idea that you could consent to being in porn sort of an impossibility, that it's always coercive. So that it harms women literally who are in porn, but it also harms women symbolically by reducing their value to be sex symbols. And this is an argument that I think is long lasting, though the mobilized effort among feminists that we really saw spike in the 1980s, that has mostly waned. There are still individual feminist activists who speak out against porn, but there isn't the same kind of mobilized effort around pornography as there was in the past with the feminist movements. And so instead, I think that the argument that pornography harms women has been taken up by conservative-led factions of the anti-porn movement. What I've seen in the 21st century is that the anti-pornography movement has really rebranded itself as an anti-sex trafficking movement. So to say that pornography is akin to sex trafficking in that it exploits largely women and people who are minors and underage. And so I wrestle in the book with these arguments over consent, agency of women performers, because at the same time as we hear these arguments about how pornography harms women in various ways, I spoke to many sex workers who pushed back against that argument. And it sounds like you've spoken to people like that as well, who have said, like, I am not a victim. I am choosing this career path over alternatives. I spoke to many women who had multiple degrees, who could have worked in many different industries. Often they were caretakers. They had children. Were caring for loved ones in varying ways. And so this provided them a flexible way to make a living. So I really wrestle with how does feminism relate to pornography, and how can you be a feminist and sort of find a feminist sensibility alongside beliefs about porn.
Did you find any porn actors or who were previously working in the business who were now against pornography and thought it was a really bad thing?
That's a really common story throughout the anti-porn movement, where you will hear people who formerly worked in the industry experienced coercion, abuse, and felt like their only path moving forward was to leave the industry. There's organizations that help women leave the industry that often tell these narratives. But at the same time, I heard from others. So I tell the story of a woman I call Jade, who has a really harrowing experience within the commercial industry. She has an agent who sexually harasses her. She travels to Europe for a porn shoot where she is physically abused and ends up participating in activities that she didn't initially agree to. And then after all of this, she doesn't get paid the amount that was initially promised to her. So she is devastated. She's physically injured, so she can't go on to work. And at this point in her story, it sounds like so many others that turn people away from the porn industry, that says, like, the porn industry is bad for women. But her take is not that. She says that I am not anti-porn, I'm pro-woman. And we need to understand the porn industry just like we understand all other workplace environments that have had to reckon with the Me Too movement and sexual harassment and exploitation at the workplace. And we need to find ways to support women within the industry so that they don't have experiences like mine. So Jade continues to work within the industry. She no longer works with an agent. She works independently, mostly producing content for websites like OnlyFans, though sometimes she'll work on commercial shoots, but she acts as her own agent to sort of set the terms of those performances. So her story sort of complicates the narrative that even for women who experience bad things in the industry, and there are certainly bad things within the industry, but many working within it say, we need to reform and change the industry for better, not say that we need to eliminate it altogether, because that's an unrealistic goal. You know, that we'll never be able to get rid of the porn industry entirely. So how can we make it safe for people within it?
Kelsy Burke is our guest. Kelsy Burke is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she is the author of the book that we are in conversation about, called The Pornography Wars, the Past, Present, and Future of America's Obscene Obsession. Kelsy Burke, you make the argument that both the, I guess we call it pro-porn and anti-porn activists have some commonalities, share some concerns.
Yeah, I think that we often hear about political debates in polarized terms, us versus them, left versus right. You know, we see this all around us. I'm not saying that like doesn't exist, but I think that there's also more to the story. And so that's in part, as a qualitative researcher, when I spend time listening to people's stories, getting to know them, I find that we all have more common ground than we might otherwise imagine there to be. So I was surprised in some ways by the fact that for many people who have radically different views about porn, their sort of higher level beliefs about freedom and autonomy, about women's protection, are all, you know, like in some ways come from the same place. There's also sort of practical things where they overlap. Like I said earlier, that both sides don't think you should watch free porn. Both sides think sex education needs to include explicit conversations about pornography with children. What those conversations look like are different depending on your beliefs about pornography. But both sides sort of see most sex education as being inadequate to prepare children who will be exposed to pornography. So that's another example where there's sort of surprising common ground.
Don't watch free porn. I mean, most people do watch free porn, but I think that's an important point.
Yeah, most people do, and that is why, these website models like Pornhub have been so hugely successful. It's also why they've been so hugely problematic, because people can upload videos with relatively little regulation. And so I think that's been really the site of a lot of controversy.
Let's talk about viewing porn now. Are there studies? Do we know the effect that porn has on people?
That's a great question. It's interesting. Out of the news, just this past week, Texas passed an age verification law that's similar to a couple of other states that requires pornographic websites to somehow verify that their users are 18 or older. Texas has gone one step further and has said in this law that pornographic websites have to also include a kind of disclaimer to the site, kind of like the Surgeon General warnings on cigarettes, that which is actually an analogy I heard repeatedly from anti-porn activists. But so Texas is requiring that pornographic websites make this statement that includes that pornography is potentially biologically addictive and that it harms human brain development. So the idea that porn harms the brain and is biologically addictive is really everywhere in the anti-porn movement. As a sociologist of religion, this was my first sort of encounter with pornography, is that I was observing how evangelical Christians were talking about sex and sexuality, and I heard them talking about porn repeatedly, but they weren't talking about the morality of porn, like that it's sinful or that it's wrong. They were talking about the fact that evangelical Christian men were becoming addicted to porn. So they were using really medical language about the harms of pornography. This is a long way to answer your question.
No, please.
Which is to say that the question about, like, what's behind the science? Do we know what happens when we watch porn? Has been deeply entangled in political and religious movements about pornography. So that's one point to make, that claims about pornography's harms or what effects it has on viewers are often wrapped up in organizations or movements that have sort of broader goals that oppose pornography in a larger way. With that said, scientists have been studying for a very long time what are the effects of watching porn, but it's really difficult to definitively say. So empirical studies offer contradictory findings. This is often because they ask different questions to different groups of people. And even for those that have sort of robust national samples, most surveys are asked at a single point in time. So it's hard to discover if it's, for example, porn that's causing dissatisfaction in marriage, or is it that you're dissatisfied in your marriage and therefore you look at more porn? So we know there's a positive correlation between these two things for heterosexual men, but we don't know exactly what causes the other. So it's this kind of chicken and egg dilemma. So from my perspective, as a sociologist trying to uncover what do we know when it comes to pornography, I think there's a lot more questions than definitive answers.
You write that there is a porn addiction industry.
That's right. So the porn addiction industry stems from what was first the sex addiction industry. It comes from a 12-step model and the spin-offs that we've seen from Alcoholics Anonymous, which got its start in the 1930s. So in the early 1970s, sex addiction movement emerged, and it really gained momentum in the 1980s when a man named Patrick Carnes, who was a member of a sex addiction recovery group and also got his PhD in counseling education, he wrote a book that he called Out of the Shadows that was about sex addiction recovery. And he's sort of touted as the founder of the sex addiction recovery movement. So Carnes was actually not well received within the broader scientific and clinical community of sexology and sex therapy. If you think about the social context in which sexology and sex therapy emerges in the 1960s, this is when they're trying to push back against the idea that we should pathologize sex. So they're interested in sort of sexual freedom and autonomy, not talking about sex being a disorder or a problem. And so the model that sex can be addictive was not well received within most scientific and clinical communities. So Carnes basically created his own. He created new professional organizations and communities, including what exists today, the Certified Sex Addiction Therapist Program, CSAT. So this is sort of the leading professional model in sex addiction therapy, which also then spills over to pornography addiction. But it's important to note that porn addiction is not a recognized disorder by the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of the APA.
Which is crazy because almost everything is listed in there.
Well, so when it comes to behavioral addictions, this is another thing that's interesting and goes back to the science of studying porn. We know a lot about chemical addictions because we're able to test these on rats. So there's been a bunch of really famous studies on like how cocaine affects rats' brains. And we know that, by dissecting rats' brains, we can say something about our own when it comes to why a certain percentage of the population tends to use these substances, even when it's harming their lives. And so we've theorized that similar things are happening with behavioral addictions, things like shopping or food addiction, gambling addictions, but we really can't definitively say because we can't test those things on rats. So rats don't respond to pornography. So that's in part why the DSM has been distancing itself from classifying behavioral addictions as problems. So for pornography, they say we just don't have the science there to understand this as being similar to other addictive behaviors.
You'll forgive me there. No, go ahead.
Well, so just to wrap up sort of the porn addiction industry aspect, there's so this model of sex or porn addiction was not well received among mainstream clinicians, but was very well received among evangelical Christians. So it aligns really nicely with an evangelical worldview that sees certain sexual behaviors as wrong or as problematic and others as right, normal, good. And so evangelical Christians, more than any other, have taken up porn addiction and the industry behind it to come up with software programs, support groups, books, websites, all to offer a resource to people who perceive themselves to be addicted to porn.
And a lot of money behind it?
I think there is a lot of money behind it. There's one company, it's called Covenant Eyes, that offers a model that's really similar to Netflix, that you can like sign up for a monthly subscription for unlimited devices, and it will track your website content. The idea is that you'll then be accountable to not want to look at pornography. And it is, I don't have the number in front of me, how many millions of dollars, $25 million, I think, that it's been making as of late. So it's a hugely growing company, and that, this is a money-making industry. And so I think it relies on the problem that it claims to solve.
In talking, as we have, about the history of pornography, and as I say that, connecting the social conflict to it, you find a link to our social wars, cultural wars today, especially when it comes what we're seeing happening right now around the country concerning certain states enacting laws, not just to restrict abortion, but also concerning transgender folks and trying to restrict what people are able to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have to think about the anti-porn movement as being a part of a broader conservative effort that relies on Protestant beliefs about gender and sexuality, which both suppose that pornography is wrong and needs to be regulated and for some people outlawed. But it also means that there are conservative religious beliefs that absolutely affect abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, and the people who are promoting these kinds of conservative laws and policies when it comes to porn are one and the same with the people who are promoting anti-transgender laws, anti-abortion laws. So the GOP platform, in many ways, has touted itself the champion of all of these efforts. In 2016, the GOP declared that pornography was ruining the lives of millions. And we see that this is sort of a wedge. So, like, for example, with book bans, that to talk about sexual explicit material being harmful, and that we need to keep it outside of the hands of children, that this is a way to also expand regulations in ways that harm or negatively affect LGBTQ folks, women, transgender people. Anti-drag bills are one example of this. Mm-hmm. How the logic behind them has to do with exposing children to sexual content. But of course, the reality of these laws is that they are disparaging anyone who's gender nonconforming and are pathologizing anything outside of the gender binary. So absolutely, I think we have to look at the broader social context in which arguments against porn are being made, and that they often connect to other conservative politics.
Are there people and even politicians or even leaders who make their career off this, promote them? They get promoted themselves for taking on these issues, and I mean today, but I also mean through history. Do we see this sort of rise of a person who is, I'm going to lead this crusade? Maybe somebody like Anthony Comstock. Now that I think of it, I'm going to lead this crusade, and hence, but there's also a personal gain in it and promoting their own career.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly there are GOP politicians who are sort of championing these, like what we'd call social conservative policies that expand across abortion, LGBTQ rights, pornography, and sex work. Just out of Utah, for example, Senator Todd Wheeler is the person who sponsored a bill in 2016 declaring pornography to be a public health crisis. He also sponsored the bill that requires age verification for users of pornographic websites. The governor of that state has signed these into law and has also signed into law bills that restrict access to healthcare for transgender youth. So I think that we are seeing the same sort of players promoting this agenda. Whether we have sort of an Anthony Comstock figure today, that's an interesting question. I think that we have different versions of that in many different kinds of conservative politicians today. So that's I think how I'd answer that question.
But it does seem like demagoguery kind of unites it all. Unites all of them.
Yeah, I think for me, it's to understand, is this really about pornography? And often the answer to that is like, it is and it isn't. It is to the extent that these laws and policies do negatively affect people who work in the sex industry. But it's also true that it's not exactly about porn, and it's more about promoting a particular worldview when it comes to gender and sexual norms that rely on a conservative logic that is much broader than pornography alone.
Kelsy, Burke, as we move to wrap up this, in what you begin your book, your introduction with a very personal story. You grew up in Wyoming, and you were a born again Christian. And then you, I believe, ran into your father's Playboy collection, which I think is probably a common experience for people from a certain generation to run into their parents' little stash of porn.
That's right. Yeah, I was really on the fence about whether I should tell this story, but I'm an academic. I don't tend to write about myself, but I knew that people picking up a book about pornography would want to know, what's my angle? What do I believe? Where do I come from? So I told this story about how I was a born-again Christian teenager, but that was at a time when I was also becoming increasingly aware that I was not a straight person, like I was supposed to be according to my church. I ended up discovering this stash of Playboy magazines that I became totally obsessed with and enamored with. And I write in the book the line that sounds sort of flippant, but it's actually quite sincere, that I feel like both Jesus and Playboy saved me as a teenager, that there are a lot of positive elements of my Christian church and community that I look back to with fondness, in a similar way that I think me coming out as a queer person has been really good for me, really good for my life. And so I tell that story to say that, we often think of these things as being in tension, religion and sexuality, but that for me and my lived experience, that wasn't true, that those things sort of existed at the same time in a real way for me. And so I use that story to try to break apart this assumption that pornography and other political debates are always this us or them opposites, when I think that there's a lot more gray area, complications, nuance went to the story.
Kelsy Burke has been our guest. She is the author of the book that we've been in conversation about. It's called The Pornography Wars, The Past, Present, and Future of America's Obscene Obsession. Kelsy Burke, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you. Same.